Appeals Division 1 is now in session.
Good morning. Please be seated. This is the time set for oral argument in PV Unified School District against Hoffman. Our cause number 1CAIC 16-0020. Councils, I'm sure you're aware we have read the briefs, we have conferenced the case, we're quite familiar with it, so bear that in mind as you begin your presentations. I should tell you that we are being audio and videotaped today, and the video will be posted online. Each side has 20 minutes for argument, and the appellant may reserve as much time as you wish, subject to watching your own clock. And with that, if you're prepared, we can begin.
May it please the court, counsel. My name is Casey Kurth. I represent the Paradise Valley Unified School District. I'm the one who requested oral argument in this case because this is a unique industrial case that involves causation between bladder cancer and exposure to mercury. This is not a conflict in the medical evidence case. Mr. Hoffman alleges that he developed bladder cancer as a result of exposure to mercury from disposing of fluorescent light bulbs using a machine called the bulb eater. In essence, his claim is that he breathed in and out mercury vapor, and this caused or contributed to his development of bladder cancer.
He was exposed to mercury, because I think there was also some evidence that he had dust on his arms, right? So wouldn't it be fair to say that it's based on exposure to mercury?
And I think that's maybe a better term, Your Honor. But when you look at the form which filed the claim, I believe it was the Form 407, the worker's report of injury, it puts that he was exposed or that he breathed in mercury, glass, and white powder. So certainly the powder would get on him. So I think that's fair. But either way, it's causation.
You would agree that our standard of review here is essentially sufficiency of the evidence, right? Not weight.
I would agree.
Okay.
And that's exactly what we challenge. In essence, Mr. Hoffman bears the burden of proof, as you know. He has to establish that it's more probable than not that he was exposed to mercury. He has to prove that it's more probable than not that that exposure caused his bladder cancer. And the Industrial Commission, they adopted the opinion of Dr. Sadeghi. Dr. Sadeghi is Mr. Hoffman's attending oncologist. The opinion is based upon the Industrial Commission award is based upon Dr. Sadeghi's opinion, and that's what we challenge. We challenge the sufficiency of that opinion.
You're not challenging that he wasn't exposed.
Correct.
You're just challenging that even if he was exposed, it didn't cause the bladder cancer.
There's no evidence that it caused it. I'll cut more to the chase. There's no evidence of mercury in his system. There's no evidence of mercury causing the bladder cancer.
Back a step. Are you suggesting that Dr. Sadeghi is not qualified to render an opinion, or just that his opinion is should not be relied on?
I think he's more than qualified if he had done the medical literature search. When Mr. Hoffman was seeing Dr. Sadeghi at one of the appointments, he asked him, do you think there's potentially a relationship between my exposure to mercury, destroying the light bulbs, and my bladder cancer? And Dr. Sadeghi told him, I'd have to investigate that. I'm not sure. Dr. Sadeghi went on to say that fluorescent light bulbs have lead and they have mercury, and these are materials that are potentially believed to be carcinogenic. Directly to the bladder, I'm not aware. What Dr. Sadeghi told Mr. Hoffman is that he would have to research the issue.
Preliminarily. But could you just focus on what was his? I'm not as concerned with what he what he told him initially about what he's going to research or what he's not going to research. Could you focus on his testimony? What about that do you view as being inadequate to at least make a case that it seemed to me that he did say that it was more likely than not that it caused the cancer?
You're correct. He said the magic words, but it's more than the magic words. It's what's the basis of his opinion. It's our position that he doesn't have factual, legal, medical, or scientific evidence in support of his opinion.
Isn't that a credibility question? If I agree that maybe a fact finder could could have come out the other way, that it is, you might want a little more rigorous research or study, but doesn't that go to the weight that the fact finder would give that testimony?
I disagree. I don't think it goes to his credibility. I think it goes to the foundation for his opinion. His whole factual information about this machine is what Mr. Hoffman told him, that he would put the bulbs in, it would smash them, and he would breathe in and out light bulbs. Well, that's not true. He's never seen how the machine operated.
Evidence in the record to that effect. Whether it's true or not, in your view, don't we have to deal with the record that we have?
Oh, we do. And so let me go then to the record. We have the sum total of Dr. Sadeghi's opinion that there's a relationship is that, number one, Mr. Hoffman is below the age of people who usually develop bladder cancer. Number two, he's not a smoker. That means there's two potential causes. This is in his testimony. He said it's either it comes from unknown sources, it's spontaneous, or environmental exposure. And in this case, we know that he was exposed to materials that our government regulates because they're potentially carcinogenic. That's the sum total of the evidence. If he had done a medical literature research...
Is there any evidence that mercury is safe?
Pardon me?
Is there any evidence that mercury is safe?
It depends, not in large quantities, I'm sure.
I rather doubt in any quantity. I mean, I understand the more granular question about whether mercury exposure causes this specific type of cancer, and there might be questions as to what levels are required, but that sounds almost more like the evidence that you would discuss in a product liability case against the manufacturer, not a workers' comp claim.
But in a workers' comp claim, you still need some relationship between exposure to mercury and bladder cancer, and that's what's missing in this case.
But if you have, I guess my problem is, one of my problems is, you have one doctor saying that there's a reasonable possibility these are connected because I've ruled out everything else. There's nothing else there. He's young, he's not been exposed to smoke, there's no other environmental exposure. And then you have Dr. Salganic,
Your Honor.
Salganic, who says he did do a literature search and found a study that reported a possible relationship with high levels of mercury exposure and bladder cancer. So why couldn't the ALJ combine those two things and say, well, okay, I've got one doctor saying, yeah, when you're exposed to mercury, the body tries to filter it out and it goes into the bladder. And another doctor saying, and I can't find any other source for this other than this mercury exposure. And another doctor saying, well, even though I disagree, I did find a study that said there's a reasonable relationship, there's a positive relationship.
Well, I disagree with that construction of Dr. Sadeghi's opinion. Dr. Sadeghi didn't rule out anything. Dr. Sadeghi didn't do any investigation at all. He testified he was caught off guard. He basically was an advocate for his patient, which he should be, and he outlined those 2 points. But he told...
When you say he's an advocate for his patient, again, you're asking us to delve into credibility. All we have is that he's a qualified physician testifying, and that's as far as we can take it.
I agree.
So we can't consider that he was an advocate for his patient and doubt his findings based on that. That's more the ALJ's job.
Well, I agree with that, Your Honor, but there's got to be a scientific medical basis for his opinion. And he admitted that he would have to research it, but he never did. If he had researched it, he would have found that one low-level study from the International Agency for the Research on Cancer, and that's a low-level study. There are basically 5 levels. There's one that it's carcinogenic, 2A, probably carcinogenic, 2B, this was a level 2B study, possibly carcinogenic, 3, it's non-classifiable, and
But why isn't it enough? I mean, you don't have to show, yes, there's a definitely this causes bladder cancer. You have to just say, you have one doctor saying, I've ruled out everything else. I don't know if there's a connection with bladder cancer, but I've ruled out everything else. And then you have a study that says there is a possible relationship between mercury exposure and bladder cancer. Why isn't that? Now, that seems to me to say, as far as sufficiency of evidence, if the ALJ wanted to reject that and say it's not enough, or I didn't find somebody credible, that's one thing, when we would probably affirm. And if he found it was credible, that was enough, we'd probably affirm on that basis too.
Well, 2 points. We deal with probabilities, not possibilities. He has to establish his claim to a reasonable degree of medical probability. And if I could back up 1 second, you asked, why couldn't the ALJ have combined the two testimonies? He could have. He didn't. He solely relied upon Dr. Sadeghi's opinion.
But we would affirm on any basis supported by the record.
Well, this opinion is based solely upon Dr. Sadeghi's opinion. If you're
For the wrong reason, we're going to reverse him?
I don't know that he's right, Your Honor. I don't think there's any.
I understand that. But if he's right for the wrong reason, in other words, he said, I only looked at this doctor's evidence, and we say, well, that's wrong, but there's other doctors' evidence that further supports you. We would revert. You're saying we would have to reverse anyway?
Well, I don't think there's other doctors' evidence that supports it. No, I agree with your analysis, but I don't think the other doctors' evidence is sufficient to establish a relationship to a reasonable degree of probability. Bladder cancer is one of the most common cancers in the United States. If you're going to establish a link between bladder cancer and exposure to mercury, there's got to be some relationship, and that's what's lacking in this case, Your Honor. And I guess I look at this last point I want you to think of. If he's exposed to mercury, and mercury is the cause of his bladder cancer, wouldn't we expect to find high levels of mercury, or for that matter, any levels of mercury in his body? There's no evidence of that.
Doesn't that goes to the credibility of the expert opinion? We don't know. I personally don't know how long mercury stays in the system, whether it's and I guess the concern I have is just echoing what's been said. Even assuming there aren't detailed studies, if you have an expert who seems to be qualified to render an opinion, and there just hasn't been a lot of research, if he gives an opinion that isn't backed by a lot of research, that goes to how much weight we would give that opinion, and that's hard to overcome.
And I would agree that it's hard to overcome, but I still come back to the fact that there's got to be an adequate foundation for the opinion. You can have an opinion as to anything, but without foundation, where does that opinion go?
It's a sensitive subject for me, or it's a subject of interest to me, the foundation for scientific evidence. And obviously, in our rules of evidence, we've changed that standard recently. At any point in the proceedings before the ALJ, was there a request for the application of a Daubert-like standard?
No, sir.
Okay.
And Daubert requires some scientific basis for the opinion.
I make no secret. I view Daubert as requiring a fairly rigorous showing, but that wasn't placed at issue here.
No, but it obviously plays a factor into the underlying opinion as to whether there's sufficient basis for the opinion in front of you. Is there sufficient foundation for an opinion linking his development of bladder cancer to his exposure to mercury?
Well, but if nobody makes a Daubert objection, it's not up to us then to invoke it.
I would agree with that, but it doesn't mean that. It still looks at it gives us, I think, some guidance as to what we're looking for adequate medical foundation. And so it's the district's position that the opinion of Dr. Sadeghi is without legal, factual, medical foundation, and that the decision should be set aside. If I may, I would like to reserve the remainder of my time for rebuttal.
Very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
May it please the Court, my name is Brian Weekly with Snow Carpio & Weekly. We represent Jeff Hoffman. Jeff is sitting in the gray suit behind me. Jeff is a claimant in this case. Addressing a couple of the points that defense counsel has made, Dr. Sadeghi is a well-qualified expert to testify about the causal relationship between the development of bladder cancer and the exposure to mercury, both inhale and on skin and in all different forms. He's Harvard trained. He completed a urology residency at Baylor, surgical internship. He's board certified in medical oncology, surgical oncology, and urologic oncology. He's a contributor to scientific literature. He has several academic appointments. He's currently on staff at Cancer Treatment Centers of America. He was a very good expert for Mr. Hoffman to call in this case, and he supported Mr. Hoffman. He opined that the exposure to these toxins, this dust, occasioned by Mr. Hoffman over the course of 3 years, destroying over 20,000 of these light bulbs, these fluorescent light bulbs. And Mr. Hoffman knew the number because each barrel had over 1,000 bulbs in it, and he would destroy all the bulbs in those, and he counted 23 to 25 barrels. He also testified at hearing that the dust was everywhere. Broken bulbs would come in from districts. When they cleaned the filters, there would be dust everywhere, et cetera. So he was exposed to the dust. Doctors,
Are you aware of any cases in other states or any literature that's talked about? I assume other people in other states have used this type of equipment. Have there been any studies linking it, or is it just the more general linkage of mercury?
I think it's a more general linkage, and I'm not aware of any studies personally.
Can you tell me whether the doctor testified, the point was made that a reasonable degree of medical probability is required. Would you address that?
Yes. Dr. Sadeghi testified that based on the foundation he had, so the description from Mr. Hoffman, his experience as an oncologist and cancer physician, the fact that Jeff, as you had previously discussed, lacked certain risk factors. He was relatively young. He had no smoking history. He had no family history. He had never been exposed to aniline dyes, which had been out of circulation for 30 to 40 years. Based on the existence of any other risk factors to a reasonable degree of medical probability, he related the bladder cancer to the exposure. Jeff had testified that he didn't typically wear any kind of breathing apparatus or filter. They would try to wear a mask when they clean the filters on the machine. Notably, during the testimony of Dr. Sadeghi, defense did not, I didn't see in review of the record, objection to any of the answers given by Dr. Sadeghi. There was not a request for post-hearing memos. There was not a request for post-hearing argument. Dr. Sadeghi then testifies to a reasonable medical probability that there's a relationship. Dr. Salganik, defendant's doctor, testified that there was a possible relationship. So the judge was deciding between possible and probable. Dr. Salganik's testimony said that an improperly operating machine could release amounts of mercury that exceed OSHA limits and cause health problems. Now, defendants failed to provide Dr. Salganik with any kind of data, test results, or any quantifiable measure of what this machine was and what it produced, and any kind of scientific measures of the kind of what kind of environment.
Are you saying that if the ALJ had gone with their expert, that you would have had a viable claim on appeal?
Possibly. My doctor was at probability, or rather our doctor was at probability, and Dr. Salganik was at possibility.
Well, but I think put differently, Dr. Salganik was at not probability. And if the ALJ had believed that it was not probable, would you have a likelihood of success on appeal?
Not sure. Good question.
Does it come down to that what Dr. Salganik did, all Dr. Salganik did was to say, listen, I found a study. And maybe it's not reasonably probable, but it's possible. It's a possible relationship. Do we need the study? I mean, if you have a medical oncologist who is qualified and he says, listen, I haven't found any studies, but I use my expertise to reason this out, which is what I understand. Let's make sure I understand. Tell me if I'm correct.
Sure.
Basically, what Dr. Sadeghi was saying is, I've got all this evidence of exposure. I've ruled everything else out. Based on my expertise, I'm telling you there's a reasonable probability this exposure caused the cancer because it would be filtered through his body and wind up in the bladder. I don't have a study to show that, but that's based on my expertise. Is that enough?
I think so, because
is that enough, and is that what happened?
I think so. It's his scientific opinion. We're dealing with two very well-qualified experts. They're putting together the information they have and rendering opinions to a reasonable medical probability. Dr. Salganik said He testified that assuming the machine was working properly, so he had to assume the machine was working properly because he had no data, he could not opine that the mercury could not have gotten through the filter, which is another way of saying the mercury could have gotten through the filter even if the machine was working properly.
Sure, but getting back to Judge Kessler's question, would such testimony, the way Judge Kessler described it, have been compliant with modern Rule 702? Surely would have been compliant with Lagerquist because almost anything was, but under the new Rule 702, if an objection had been made, would that be enough?
Would that be enough to allow the testimony?
Correct.
I think so.
How would you comply with Daubert by simply saying, I'm a scientist and I have an opinion? I mean, I think the purpose of Rule 702 was to make scientists explain the bases for their opinions.
At the commission, the rules are relaxed, and so I did not represent Mr. Hoffman at hearing.
It's a hypothetical question. I said if objection had been made, but I'm curious of your views.
That's a hard question to answer. It goes to the foundation for both doctors' testimony. Is that correct, Judge? The scientific foundation for both physicians' testimony?
Sure. I mean, assuming Rule 702 applied in its fullness and were properly invoked, I think it would apply equally to both doctors.
Okay. I'm not sure.
But
okay. I'm sorry.
But we don't have that objection here. Is based on your review of the record?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Dr. Salganik cited a study regarding the possible relationship between mercury exposure and bladder cancer. So he cited a study, and he said the relationship was possible. So again, we have Mr. Hoffman's doctor saying it's a probable relationship, making the reasonable degree of medical probability, and Dr. Salganik saying it is possible. The ALJ resolved this medical conflict in favor of Dr. Sadeghi. Dr. Sadeghi's testimony was not equivocal, it was committal, and he rendered it to within a reasonable degree of medical probability. Judges resolve these medical conflicts every day at the Industrial Commission, just like this. A cancer case, I don't think, is any different than a knee case or a shoulder case or a spinal case. The doctor testifies with or without a reasonable degree of medical probability. I'm sorry. This case is like the Hackworth versus Industrial Commission case. Hackworth involved a Morton's neuroma on a claimant's foot. The claimant presented medical testimony. Defense presented testimony from a Roger Grimes. Dr. Grimes equivocated. The judge went with Dr. Grimes and rendered a non-compensable claim decision. That was reversed on appeal because Dr. Grimes' testimony was equivocal, subject to more than one meaning. Dr. Sadeghi's testimony was not equivocal. It was unequivocal. One final point, the legislature recognizes that certain occupations are cancer-prone, like police officers and firefighters, and there's some statutory expansions of different types of cancer that have I would say, a lower burden of proof in proving these statutory classifications. There is no basis for reversal. In this case, we would urge the court to affirm the decision.
Getting back to Judge Swan's question, and again, it's hypothetical because no objection was raised, but as I understood it, Dr. Sadeghi did give reasons of how the body processes carcinogens, and therefore, and that was the basis of his, okay, if he's been exposed, here's how the body processes it. It tries to get rid of it, filters it out, and winds up in the bladder. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Judge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may pick up where he left off in regards to the histology of bladder cancer and that, Dr. Salganik did address that, and he said it's a different histology between developing cancer of the liver or bladder and that. So, but
did he have any medical treatises to support him on that, or was it just his opinion?
That was based on his opinion.
Okay.
And I think then if we want to go to Hackworth, Hackworth is a Morton's neuroma case, and it basically found the opinion is unsupported by specific facts or medical literature, and it cannot reasonably be relied upon. Well, that hits the nail on the head here. Dr. Salganik's opinion is not it's not based upon specific facts or medical literature.
It's a little surprising that this fact pattern has never arisen in the mining context. Are you aware of any cases dealing with heavy metal exposure in Arizona that might be useful to us?
I am not. I saw the Valley Fever case is obviously a completely different thing. It's a odorless, colorless thing, and they talk about statistics. But no, I did not find any mining cases on point. But I go back to the fact that you look at the expert opinion and the basis for the expert's opinion, and this is my take on it. He said this to be an advocate for his patient. He didn't do the research that he said he would need to do to make an opinion as to whether there's even a relationship between exposure to mercury and bladder cancer. And that's what we challenge. That's what's missing here is there a relationship? Even if he's exposed, and there's no doubt he's exposed, but we don't know what the levels are in his system. This is a chronic exposure over 3 years. I would think there would be some evidence that is in his system. They do blood draws. They do other tests to determine mercury in the system, but there's no evidence of mercury in his system. There's no evidence of a link between mercury, or I should say a link to a reasonable degree of medical probability between exposure to mercury and bladder cancer. And the last thing I'll leave you with is the legislature. It was brought up about the legislature is now, as we sit, considering new legislation to make it a presumption that a firefighter or a policeman, certain types of cancers are related. That is based upon the International Agency for the Research on Cancer, same place that Dr. Salganik used his study from. And that's based upon a higher level study that's possible, or that's probable, not possible. And so in our opinion, Dr. Sadeghi's opinion lacks foundation because there's no scientific evidence of a probable relationship between exposure to mercury and bladder cancer. Thank you.
Thank you both, counsel, for your arguments. This matter is now under advisement. We'll issue a written decision in due course, and we stand adjourned.
Thank you.